Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on visas for treaty investors and treaty traders. We'll get started promptly at noon sharp.
I can hear something echoing in the background.
Does it sound okay?
Yeah, that's better. I don't know what that was.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it another minute for additional followers to join us, and we'll get started momentarily. All right, we'll give it another minute. And we will get started in about 30 seconds. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Thursday webinar. Today we are going to be speaking about visas for treaty traders and also treaty investors. I'm Jennifer Boehm. I'm a partner with Berardi Immigration Law, and Berardi Immigration Law is also immigration counsel to Barclay Damon. We enjoy working with that firm very much. And I'm here today with my colleague, Zach Ahlstrom. Zach, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Yep. Like Jen said, my name is Zach Ahlstrom. I'm a senior attorney here at Berardi Immigration Law, and we're very excited to share some information about e-visas.
Yes, so thank you for joining. Just so everyone's aware, you're obviously welcome to take notes, but we will also be posting this webinar clip on our social media channels. So please like and follow Berardi Immigration Law as well, and you can hear all of these great notes about the E-1 and E-2 visa categories. Zach, do you want to kick us off and give an introduction to either the E-1 or the E-2? Take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the E-1 and the E-2, they're distinct visas. They share a lot of the same benefits, but they are distinct categories. So the E-1 is referred to as the treaty trader visa, and the E-2 is referred to as the treaty investor visa. Now, the E-1 is, there's essentially two common scenarios that we see specifically with Canadians in which the E-1 can be a great asset. And this is going to be either a Canadian service company that has an established business in Canada and has clients in the United States, and they need a work permit, they need a visa so that they can travel to the US and provide services to these clients. This is a very common scenario, probably the most common scenario for our practice. But another common scenario is a case where you have maybe it's a US company that's owned by Canadians that imports a lot of their product from Canada, and they're selling it domestically in the United States. They're both suitable situations for an E-1 visa that's going to provide not only the owners of the business, but essential employees of the business with visas and work permits, which is going to let them enter the United States and provide their services. Now, the E-2 visa is a little different. This is the treaty investor visa. And this is going to be utilized by foreign entrepreneurs or foreign business owners or corporations that want to set up a business in the United States. So there's really three common scenarios that we see with the E-2. That's going to be just your general entrepreneur that wants to open a business in the United States. There's going to be a established business in Canada that wants to open a subsidiary or affiliate or just a U.S. office in general, or someone in Canada that wants to purchase an existing business in the United States. you don't necessarily have to set up a new entity in order to qualify for an E-2. You can actually use that visa to go and acquire an existing business in the United States and get that E-2 visa. Similar to the E-1, it's a great tool that's going to allow not only the business owners, but essential employees to enter the United States and work.
Yeah, great introduction to those categories, Zach. So like Zach said, they are separate visas, but we do refer to them as sister categories. And sometimes there is overlap. You may be a foreign national who qualifies for both the E-1 and the E-2. And for whatever reason, we'll pick one over the other. So to recap that, the E-1, we like to say this is for people or companies who are doing substantial trade between their home country. I know we have a lot of Canadian listeners today. Canada is a treaty country for E-1 and E-2 visa purposes. And so we like to tell our clients, think of this like a business person who is regularly shipping goods or providing professional services across the US border. Trade can mean goods like machinery, food, clothing, widgets, whatever physical, tangible product. Or it can also apply to services. And we often see that in the consulting and engineering industries, but also technology, logistics, banking. So goods or services can qualify for the E-1 business model. And then, of course, because this is a category that is rooted in a treaty-based visa benefit, at least 50% of the trade that the business does have to be between the US and that treaty country. So when we're speaking with our clients, we like to give an example of, think of your business model and think of 3 different buckets, okay? One bucket is for your US-based clients or buyers, if we're talking about a good, clients, if we're talking about a service, your home country, so let's assume for purposes of today, that's Canada. And then a third bucket for everybody else, whoever you're selling or providing your services to. And we want to make sure that, excluding that Canada bucket, at least 50% of the trade or more is that US bucket is bigger than the everybody else bucket. Okay, so the majority of trade in services or goods does have to be between the US and the treaty company. For the E-2, we like to say this is for people or companies who are investing a significant amount of money in the US. So if your trade or your professional service that you're providing, you're doing that to a lot of other countries as well, or providing that for a lot of other international clients, perhaps the E-1 isn't the best fit. But let's say you want to start a business in the US, and the spirit of the E-2 is really to create jobs for American workers. There is an investment component, but the business model also has to be suitable. And we need to assert that your business is ultimately going to create jobs for Americans. It doesn't have to be overly robust. Having a few employees on payroll could be the ultimate goal. We also can qualify companies that engage in US-based contractors sometimes. So the E-2 is to create a business in the US and to better the US economy, ideally through the provision of jobs for American workers. A lot of clients ask about, well, can I purchase property and make a property investment? Zach, that's one of the most common questions we get from E-2 investors. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so it's a good starting point, but in and of itself, it's not enough. So like you said, the spirit of the E-2 visa is to benefit the US economy, create jobs for US workers, and establish what the government considers a non-marginal business. Mm-hmm. And simply going and purchasing property in the United States is just not going to cut it. However, it is a good starting point because you can turn that into something like a property management business. If you go and say you purchase a number of properties, and I've had a lot of clients do this where they go and they purchase a number of properties and they rent them out on Airbnb or they just rent them out themselves. And then they go and hire some personnel to sort of maintain and upkeep the property. Maybe they go hire a property manager and they create a little business out of it. Mm-hmm. And if you're willing to do that and you have the capital to do that, that's a situation that's going to result in a strong E-2 visa application.
Great. Another question that we often get for our e-visa clients is, well, what kind of industry qualifies for an E-2? What's your answer to that?
There's no limit. You know, the industry itself, as long as it's not the cannabis industry, because we do get that
Yeah.
question a lot, because cannabis is still federally illegal in the United States. There's really no limit to it. You really just have to have credentials and a background that is suitable to operate and run a business of that nature. That's really what the government's looking for.
Mhm. And then one last question on the e-visa category. A lot of times clients are saying, well, I have a pretty robust business and I do have clients in the US, but I've been crossing the border as a visitor. And then maybe they reach out to us because all of a sudden CBP stopped them and said, nope, we don't like what you're doing. You're coming in too frequently. Give me a little bit of best practice tips for when a Canadian client is reaching that threshold of when it's appropriate to cross and enter and spend time in the US as a business visitor versus when should they consider going after that visa? And then we'll dive into what does the process look like?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's no harm in being proactive. That's usually going to be the best practice in general, is just to be proactive about it. If you know that you're going to have frequent or extended trips to the United States for
Mhm.
business reasons, it's always worth exploring work permit opportunities. If you're not eligible for any work permits, the best practice in that scenario is going to be to limit the frequency of your trips, limit the duration of your trips, because at the end of the day, your story has to make sense to a customs officer. And if you go to the border and you say, hey, I'm entering for 2 months for business meetings, they're not going to buy that, because no one is entering for 2 months worth of business meetings and not having any other work related responsibilities that they need to conduct while they're in the US. And that's really the litmus test. If you're in the United States and you need to work outside of just simple business meetings or attending a conference or webinar, then you need a work permit to do that. So if you're entering for business as a visitor, like I said, you want to limit your trips in duration, you want to limit the frequency of your trips, and you want to travel prepared. So have documentation demonstrating, proving the activities you're engaging in, where you're going, where you're staying, that you're returning back to Canada, and bring proof of your ties to Canada to show the officer that you have something to return to. And if you do that, that's generally sufficient. But again, it's always best to be proactive and at least explore options.
Yeah, that's great advice, Zach. And I want to echo again for our listeners, the government's litmus test is where you're physically present when you're doing activities that can be construed as work. So while you may feel you're in startup mode, if you're exploring a new business, let's say you've purchased a warehouse to sell your widget or house your widgets that you're ultimately going to be shipping to customers. If you've purchased that warehouse, you've incorporated a business, you have US business activity going, even if you're just going in to observe, the government might not feel that you're sticking within the bounds of permissible business visitor activity. So before you reach that point and you're at a crossroads of your business model, it would be good to get your visa application in for processing before you are not admitted into the US as a visitor. Another strategy some of our clients do in that business model is they incorporate their enterprise, they've secured their warehouse, and they're immediately hiring a US worker to do the hands-on work. Sometimes that can be enough to tamper CBP's concerns about what the Canadian visitor is doing. If they can point to someone else in the US who's doing that hands-on activity to keep the business running, then you may have a little bit more flexibility and time. Also, for an E-2 strategy, having someone immediately on payroll at the time we submit the application is really good. The government likes to see that. They see that you're serious about your business. We jumped ahead a little bit before we get into the application process. One of the questions we often get for E-2 visa purposes is, well, how much do I need to invest to qualify for the E-2? And when do I need to invest that money? Zach, how do you advise clients with respect to that question?
Yeah, so with the investment itself, there's no specific number threshold that you have to meet.
Mhm.
The regulations are very vague. Instead, there's really two things that a consular officer is looking for. Number one, they need to see that the total amount, the total number that you've invested in the U.S. entity is sufficient to commit you to that enterprise. And in practice, you know, we submit a ton of these cases, and anything under 50,000 is usually going to be heavily scrutinized. So we typically recommend an investment of 60 to 100,000 plus. But again, the more you spend, the more likely it is your investment is going to be deemed sufficient. Additionally, they also want to see that based on your investment, you've got the business operationally ready. They need to see that if they issue the visa, based on your investment, the business is ready to go to hit the ground running and to operate immediately. So if you can satisfy those two requirements, that's generally going to be sufficient for the investment. Now, in terms of actually spending the money, simply transferring $60,000, $100,000 to a U.S. bank account is not in and of itself sufficient. You have to commit that to the enterprise by actually spending it on your setup expenses. So you want to go out and buy equipment, supplies, tools, inventory, hire personnel, marketing, build a website, whatever you need to do to get that company, your business, in a position to begin operating. You need to go and actually spend money on those things in order to qualify for the E-2 visa.
Yeah. This leads to a nice case study that we often, this is a strategy we often use for clients who come to us. They need access to the US market. They've been traveling to the US with too much frequency. They're starting to feel the heat at the border, but they say, listen, I just don't have enough to invest in the US at this time. I can once I actually am in the US and can really develop my enterprise. Don't rule yourself out from an e-visa just because you don't have cash flow to start your business. One of the strategies that we really often do for our Canadian clients, let's take the example of a consultant or someone who is providing professional services, whether it's consulting, engineering work. We do a lot of photographers. We have a lot of clients that are professional photographers for weddings. And they're not ready to incorporate an enterprise in the US and start a US business or commit to hiring a US worker, but they need access. They need to be physically present in the US and have a valid work authorization so that they can perform hands-on activity. So we might start with the E-1 visa, and we'll document with signed contracts the call for their professional trade in their services. Okay, we argue the substantiality component, whether that's in the number of times they're needed to cross the border throughout the US or the amount of money that they're making through those contracts. So a quick side note on that, remember, the consulate and the government is not going to approve a visa without true tangible evidence that your services, the call for your professional services or your professional your product is needed and it's contracted. So we like to show signed, sealed, delivered contracts between, it could just be a Canadian entity, perhaps it's a US entity, and then the end client. So we'll set that up, we'll get an E-1 visa in place, and that allows the Canadian professional to have access to the US market. And then oftentimes, inevitably, we'll hear from them 2-3 years later, and they're ready to incorporate a US entity and hire a US worker to support their business needs in the US. And by that time, we can document money that they've spent to expand their US presence, whether that's through work, legal permits, licensing, travel costs, what else? We get creative. It really varies based on different business models. So if you're a professional and you want access to the US market and you think to yourself, oh, I just don't have enough money to invest and qualify for an E-2, don't rule your options out. Oftentimes we can set a long-term strategy in place to get you here, get you lawfully working, being able to be in the US, and then we can pivot later to an E-2. One last note, and then I'll turn it over to you, Zach, for the application process. When you hold an E-2 visa or an E-1 visa, you are not required to live physically in the US. As Zach mentioned earlier, this is key. The government's litmus test is where you're physically based when you are performing hands-on work. And so a visa is a great benefit to facilitate your entries, to show up at the border and tell the officer, yeah, I'm working for the weekend, or I'm working this event, or I'm selling to a client. They let you in and you can return back to your home base in Canada.
Yeah, so just one thing before we jump into the process and just some of the benefits of the E-2, and then wrap it up. With the investment itself, like Jen was saying, you don't have to spend the money all at once. You can document an investment over a several-month period, even over several years. And the best way to go about it is just keep track of your expenses. All we have to do is create some sort of nexus to that US business and we can likely count it for your investment for E-2 visa purposes, even if
Mhm.
the U.S. company isn't established yet. If you're traveling to the United States to do preparatory activities before you even go incorporate a U.S. company, we can likely count those expenses towards your initial investment. So
Yeah.
when people come to us and they say, you know, I only have about 40, 50,000, I don't know if it's enough, it's likely going to end up being more than what they think initially. So like Jen said, don't rule yourself out. There are very creative ways to beef up your investment and qualify for the E-2 visa.
Yeah, and the best clients are those who are somewhat organized. So save your receipts, save your invoices, save your purchase orders, and keep a detailed log in QuickBooks or whatever financial platform you're using of those expenses that are somewhat related to your US business. Because when you're able to pull that documentation in an organized manner, that helps us draft a strong case on your behalf. In these applications, we need to provide evidence of the money trail and evidence of costs that have been spent towards your investment. And that includes receipts and invoices and purchase orders. So stay organized if this is something that you're thinking about planning, and speak with, if you have somebody helping with your finances, ask them to help keep things organized, move it into a folder, and make sure that you can pull a very nice detailed list of expenses that have been incurred to start up your US enterprise. And same on the E-1 side. What money is coming in from your US clients versus your Canada-based clients versus your clients everywhere else. We need those financial reports, and we need evidence to document those sorts of details to make a successful case on your behalf. Zach, let's jump into the application process and the timing of how long it takes to get an e-visa, particularly out of Canada. And then we'll wrap things up for our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. So for all first-time initial E-2 visa applicants, the application process is going to be handled by the U.S. Consulate in Toronto. So
Is it for Canadians? For our
Canadian,
Canadian listeners.
for
Yeah.
Canadians, yeah, exactly. And I like to think of it, the process itself, I like to break it down into 3 phases. The first phase is your prep phase. This is where you're actually going, and if it's an E-2 visa, you're setting up a business, you're investing in the company, you're getting ready to actually draft and submit an application. For an E-1, it's the same thing. You're pulling financial records, you're pulling documentation, you're providing it to us, and we're drafting an application. The end of step 1 is the actual submission. What we end up having to do is trim down an entire application packet to 50 pages, submit an electronic copy to the U.S. Consulate in Toronto. They take about 3 to 4 weeks to review it. And once they've completed a review, they'll reach out, they'll notify us and say, okay, we've looked at everything. Go ahead and schedule a visa appointment. It's at that point we can go in, we get access to the consulate's calendar. And this is really step 2. It's that review phase, going and scheduling a visa interview in Toronto. And then phase 3 is the actual visa interview itself. So anyone applying for this initial E-2 visa or an E-1 visa has to go to an in-person visa interview at the U.S. Consulate in Toronto. The nice thing is the interviews themselves don't last. They're not as daunting as they may seem. They're usually about 5 to 10 minutes at most. And then you get a decision on the spot. If your case is approved, a consular officer is going to tell you. They're going to keep your passport to create the visa as a physical page in the passport. And then once you get your passport back, you're good to go. You use that passport with the visa in it to enter an E-1 or E-2 status. And it brings you into some of the benefits of this category. The visa itself is valid for 5 years. This applies to both the E-1 and the E-2. You get a 5-year visa in your passport. It's valid for unlimited entries to the United States, and it's renewable indefinitely. So as long as you continue to satisfy the requirements of either the E-1 and E-2, you can renew your 5-year visa in 5-year increments indefinitely. It feels a lot like you're living permanently in the United States, although you're holding a temporary visa, but it has that type of longevity. And it's also beneficial because upon approval, your company, the initial applicant, your company is registered as an e-visa business, and you can sponsor additional employees as long as they're Canadian citizens for employee visas. And they receive the same exact benefits as you. 5-year visa, unlimited entries, renewable indefinitely. So it's one of the best U.S. immigration categories, both the E-1 and E-2, because of the benefits that you have. Then in terms of timing, hypothetically speaking, assume that we have phase 1 is done. Assume we have a case prepared. We're submitting it today. It's about a 2-month turnaround to get your visa. Like I said earlier, it's about 3 to 4 weeks for the consulate to do their initial review. And then it can be anywhere from another 3 to 4 weeks at most, sometimes sooner, to get a visa interview in Toronto. It's only about 3 to 4 days, 3 to 5 days sometimes to get your passport back after a successful interview. So on average, the general turnaround time from submission is about 2 months.
Very good. And it's really nice, again, for the larger companies that qualify for the e-visa program. Once that initial candidate goes, and we usually suggest that it's an owner or a high-level executive who can speak about the company's financial standing, particularly on the E-2 side, and somebody who's familiar with that investment. Not only is that initial applicant getting the 5-year visa, but again, as Zach mentioned, the company is going to be registered in Toronto's e-visa program for Canadians for a 5-year period. And that's a really huge benefit, because what then happens is the company, if it has really robust operations in Canada, any other treaty national, whether it's a new hire or somebody who's been long tenured with the firm, with the company, they can apply for an E-2 visa as an essential employee or manager or supervisor with the business. And it's a much faster process for employees to apply than getting that initial application in for that first time applicant, which again involves the company registration process. So once the company is registered, then we prepare pretty streamlined packets explaining how that individual is eligible for the e-visa. We schedule an appointment for them. There's no pre-review done by the consulate. They show up for their appointment. We give them their talking points, and they're good to go. They get that 5-year visa in their passport as well. So we love the e-visa program for our Canadian cross-border clients. Zach, anything to add before we let our listeners go enjoy the rest of their lunch hour?
No, I think that really covers most of it. Just to touch back on the timeline, you mentioned the employee visas, just to give everyone an idea of how quickly those can turn around. I mean, you can, to be honest, if appointment availability is what it looks like today, you can turn around an employee visa application in like 2 to 4 weeks, probably closer to 2 weeks if you need to. So it's very quick, and also it's pretty straightforward in terms of obtaining that visa. The threshold for the type of employee that qualifies is much lower than a lot of other visa categories that multinational corporations are utilizing to transfer personnel. So the umbrella of employees that are eligible for this E-2 visa is very large. So it's an excellent benefit for cross-border business.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all for tuning in. We love being part of Barclay Damon's cross-border team. We're very familiar with the e-visa category, along with other work permit and visa options for Canadians. If you're a non-Canadian who's listened and tuned in today, thank you for joining us. If you're a member of a treaty country, the UK, Australia, what other countries? We work with investors and traders from all over the world. So while we used Canada today as an example, you're welcome to reach out with us. Please feel free to use the QR code to book a consultation. Similarly, our emails are posted on our website, so feel free to send us a message if you're curious about more details of these categories. We have lots of information posted on our website and social media channels, not just about the e-visas, but about other visa categories as well. So please like, join, and follow along. And we'd love to speak with you if you're curious about exploring one of these categories. Thanks for tuning in, and please join us again. We have a pretty robust webinar session lineup. The first Tuesday of the month, our managing partner, Rosanna Berardi, speaks about Trump updates and how any news is impacting the U.S. immigration side of U.S. policy. And then we also have very topic-related webinars scheduled throughout each month. So please follow our social media, and thanks again for tuning in.